Welcome to today's meeting of the Transportation and Environment Committee. We are here today to review and potentially offer a recommendation to the full council and the executive on a joint position on the county preferred alternative for 495-270's Managed Lanes project. Dr. Orland will walk us through the issues at hand and his recommendations for moving a recommendation for the DEIS to the full council. He'll summarize the high-level deficiencies found by our Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, and we have staff from the commission as well as from our Department of Transportation who can speak to transportation planning issues. I would like to add a few high-level comments to frame the discussion that I think will not surprise anyone, given that the data out there and the evidence for this plan have not changed greatly. I'm very concerned about the financial implications of the project after the significant failures of the Purple Line P3 at this point. MDOT still seems to be pushing forward with a new P3, which is larger in complexity and scope and impact. I certainly believe that it would be irresponsible not to include estimates for extended litigation, for cost overruns from design changes, land acquisition, and construction delays. And if MDOT wants to avoid those costs, it should make the record for decision of the DEIS concurrent with the phasing. If not, it jeopardizes really the whole project. And we've said since the beginning that MDOT should focus on the parts of this project that there's greater agreement on, such as revamping the American Legion Bridge, rather than and then tackle the more controversial positions later. We also, since the beginning of this project, have learned about significant unaccounted for costs to ratepayers at WSSC and other utilities. The state hasn't definitely addressed the extremely concerning issue of taxpayer liability for the utility costs. And we know, not thanks to MDOT staff, but to a whistleblower at WSSC, that the costs alone could exceed $1 billion. We don't know even basic information from the state yet about who will pay for those costs and if there are costs expected for other utilities. But I was glad that our council and the Prince George's Council already indicated to WSSC and to the state that they don't expect to raise rates for WSSC ratepayers to compensate the concessionaire for the costs of utility relocation. And certainly in the last year, since we vigorously discussed this proposal, we've had a big national conversation about social equity. And in this regard, I feel like the DEIS is significantly tone deaf. I'm very dismayed at the conclusion that every person will benefit from this project when we know, by definition, when you create managed lanes, they almost by definition benefit those with the ability to pay to drive in the managed lanes. And it's well established that they create a perverse incentive to maintain congestion in the free or public lanes to create the financial incentive to drive in the managed lanes. We don't do that with water or many other public goods, and I have a concern about doing it with our major transport elements of our transportation system. And then finally, obviously, it has to be, goes without saying that this project needs to be reconsidered in a COVID, post-COVID environment. We know vehicles miles traveled have dropped considerably due to COVID and are expected to stay that way. I call everyone's attention to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority study that predicts lowered vehicle miles traveled through 2025. They surveyed both employers and commuters in doing that, and I think it holds a lot of lessons for this project that at least haven't been acknowledged or rebutted by MDOT, to my knowledge. So on the question of recommending an alternative today, I am grateful to the recommendations to the Planning Board Chair and Ms. Rubin for their recommendations. I think it's highly significant to get a unanimous recommendation from a bipartisan, bi-county commission. It's exactly the type of cooperation and data-driven decision-making we wish we saw from both parties in Washington, and I think we'd be foolish not to strongly consider their recommendations. We put forward, based on the advice of our smartest transportation planners, an alternative that was sort of lively not considered by MDOT, and I really think we need to return to that because in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, I really believe that still reflects our best thinking, particularly in an environment increasingly focused on social equity and on reduced travel due to COVID. So I'll I'll stop there. I greatly look forward to the discussion. Dr. Orland, why don't I turn it over to you to walk us through the packet, unless I've missed anything.
Okay, thank you very much. As you know, again, the state issued their draft EIS in July, and they have extended the deadline for comment for the public, including from elected officials, to November 9th. So this meeting is a way of the committee trying to see if it could develop a recommendation for the full council, which is going to meet on November the 5th. And hopefully at the end of that meeting, there'll be a joint executive council position on this. I just want to say that I did invite Lisa Choplin and Jeff Folden and Karen Brookman from the state to participate in this, but I knew that they probably couldn't because they said all along their role in this stage is to listen. And so they politely declined, but they are going to they're either watching this right now or they will be watching it in rebroadcast on the web shortly. So they are trying to keep track of what the council is doing. First thing is having to do with the public hearing comments. We had asked the public to send us copies of their testimony that they gave to the state at the virtual public hearings in August, as well as the in-person hearings they held in September, one of which was in Montgomery County, to send us copies because we weren't necessarily going to get that from the state in a timely basis for this meeting. So they have done that. Carol Rubin, who's been really our lead county person on this project for now a couple of years, dutifully listened to all of the hearings and made summaries of all the testimony. And I'd like to, rather than my stealing her show, I'd like to give her a few minutes to present her summary of that. So, Carol, go ahead.
That would be great, and I'm eager to hear from Carol. I just I was remiss, I didn't call on my colleagues to see if they had anything to add.
Oh.
Number Delando after the committee colleagues may want to say a few things as well. Comments from my colleagues at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good. Well, thank you for your opening comments. Thank you to council staff for putting together a set of recommendations for us to take a look at. I think it's important to kind of articulate the bigger picture here, which is that we are looking for a firmer commitment from the state to significant transit expansion. I would really like to see firm plans around MARC, expanding MARC, and I've been arguing for that at every step of the way, and we still really haven't seen the governor embrace that. And I don't think we should move forward without getting more clarity and ideally negotiating for more support to transit expansion as part of this Quarter Cities Transitway, MARC expansion, crucial transit service that can serve the Up County. I do like the BRT concept that's embedded in this project. I think the idea of creating dedicated on and off ramps for BRT is smart, and it's the only transit connection at the moment that seems in the short term realistic to the Dulles corridor. So I think we need to keep that in mind. MARC doesn't go that way, and Red Line does, but it takes a long way. It's a long trip to take the Red Line to the Silver Line. So I think that there are real issues with the EIS that we just have to get clear on, and it does feel a little premature to pick a local alternative. I also think we really need to see the Purple Line partnership back on track, back on a solid path moving forward. I think it would be a mistake for the state to launch into this one before it has resolved the existing PPP. Not saying that can't happen. I think it can, but it's still under development, and I think we're all unclear as to whether there's going to be significant funding needed from the state or whether they can proceed on a PPP basis again for construction of the Purple Line. And that, of course, is a major question that's looming out over there, and to kind of be rushing headlong into a new PPP at the same time, feels problematic. I think that Glenn's specific ideas certainly has a lot to offer. Particularly what I wanted to comment on, and I guess this goes in a little bit of a different direction here, but the idea of converting existing lanes to managed lanes, I really support. I think we should be getting behind congestion pricing and carbon pricing, and that's what managed lanes are. I think the alternative to managed lanes is free lanes, which are sprawl-inducing and not something that we should support ever. The kind of willy-nilly expansion of highways with free lanes is an idea from the past. And tolling programs are the only situation under which I think it really could be acceptable to expand capacity, and really we should be converting existing lanes as much as possible. That's not easy to do. People don't want that, but the idea that we've been presented here to convert several of the HOV lanes into a tolling lane program is something that we should really consider, because the alternative is far, it's untenable. Another point I just want to make is that in Northern Virginia, they're using their tolling revenue to fund major transit system expansion. And one of the reasons why I really want to see that firmer commitment from the state is I'd like to see how the state could put something significant together if that was really a priority. The Virginia model of funding the Long Bridge substantially with toll revenue and a lot of other transit system expansion is a good model. We're just not seeing it sufficiently in the state's plan in Maryland. And of course, as we know, Secretary Ron said, well, that was the purple line. We did that already. Or that was Metro. We did that already. That's not sufficient. We need to see this all together as a package. So I do think we need to continue pressing and negotiating with the state to get the kind of transit-focused, non-sprawl inducing plan that we want. And at the same time, we do need to recognize that we've got to be part of a connected region. And it is really important for us, for the whole region, to be better connected. And, that's by all modes of transportation. The county has for a really long time favored the expansion of the bridge, and we should not walk back from that. We have favored expansion of 270 capacity, and we should not walk back from that either. We do have significant needs. I think Up County has significant needs. So, these are all challenges that we're trying to balance. I know we are, but in any event, it does feel premature to be picking a locally preferred alternative at this time. So many questions that are unanswered, but look forward to proceeding with our dialogue today. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everybody, for being here for this important conversation. But I'm going to point out something that's obvious. There is a party that is not here right now, and that is the state. MDOT is not here, and they are not participating in this conversation, nor have they really participated in a dialogue with us over the last number of years, which leads to the frustration that I have, that I know many of my colleagues, having listened to your opening statements, have, and that our constituents have as well. It doesn't help our community or county when we're talking about real issues that need solving, but it is not a dialogue. And so this is a hard conversation that we're going to have today because we are missing key players. So with that said, as has been mentioned, and I appreciate the thoughtful comments by the chair and by Councilmember Reamer, and just to expand upon some of those thoughts, the fact that we're sitting here I'm sitting, I don't know if everybody else is sitting, but the fact that we are here having this conversation right now about what would be the largest public-private partnership in the country, on the heels of another quite large public-private partnership also here in the state that is problematic, is a problem into itself. And so the trust that I have entering into any kind of, or allowing the state to enter into any public-private partnership is certainly suspect right now. And that concern with the state extends to just the way they've been going through this process by never really engaging in a conversation about public transit. And there are, I think, scatterings of it throughout the report and throughout their plans, but it never coalesced into anything. And to think about regional transportation, at least here in the county, without giving real heft to, be it bus rapid transit, expansion of the MARC, the CCT, all of these options that have long been discussed, and some of them even vetted, quite frankly, is a problem as well. And when we look at the way other jurisdictions have entered into these managed lanes, particularly Northern Virginia, as Councilmember Raymer just mentioned, Northern Virginia used their managed lanes to help support public transportation infrastructure. And so if we are really looking at Northern Virginia as a guiding light and as an extension of their infrastructure across the American Legion Bridge and into Maryland, there are many aspects of it that we should emulate, but are not part of this report or part of the governor or MDOT's thinking. And then the last point is the county, leadership across the county have been supportive of changes, of upgrades, particularly of the American Legion Bridge, and even reversible lanes on 270. And so those are things that there is common ground on, but the way that the DEIS was done quite possibly was fatally flawed, in that it never tried to alleviate or answer any of our concerns, because it was never part of a dialogue that we so much wanted to have, understanding that we need to have a holistic approach here to solving our transportation problems. And so those are my opening thoughts. We'll dig into the details in the next however long this conversation takes place. But thank you all for all the work that you've been doing up until this point, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Well said. Thank you to both of you and Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues. Thank you. It's great to join the T&E committee and be with you. Look, you all have made my job easy. I'll just drive a couple points home that I wanted to join today to talk about. If you come to me after you've demonstrated, the state, that we're having trouble with a major P3 partnership, it's in significant flux. We don't know where the funding, who's going to manage the project. And then to say we're going to move forward with another major project where there's not agreement with the affected parties and counties. And we know our colleagues in Prince George's County have significant concerns as well, and we'll be, working to coordinate and work together with them. Then you have, again, this is not a no. We've submitted and I want to commend Councilmember Hucker and Glass and in this committee and Reamer and others and the whole council. We've written multiple letters, suggested multiple different avenues, and transit is not. I think Councilmember Glass put it well. It's sprinkled in, but the cake was never baked. We don't have a really deep commitment to transit in a multimodal way throughout this plan. And we haven't said no. We've said reversible lanes, yes. Expand 270 in the northern parts. We've said I agree with Councilmember Reamer that the managed lanes approach for existing capacity, maybe we can add one more general lane, but I think generally I agree with that. And so we're trying to be constructive, trying to work with the state. I think this is highly problematic. And one specific example I wanted to give is I know I see Ms. Rubin and Director Wright on here as well. We were at the Moses Morningstar Cemetery just 2 weeks ago, and I stood, literally could feel the wind from the cars swishing by as I looked down at a marker of a red flag of where dozens of bodies, African-American bodies, are buried. We don't know. We know that this community was decimated once with the Beltway, as is the story around the country, cutting through the community. And here we are considering, under the current plans, disturbing the resting place of these folks again in a plan that's not ready for prime time. And I just wanted to call that out specifically because I think that is abhorrent. None of us should allow it to happen. And it has been suggested by SHA that, maybe we'll need to move some bodies. No, we will not move those bodies. That is not called for, and it will not be acceptable. And I'm glad the Washington Post covered it. And I know my colleagues have care and have seen this as well. It's just one of many examples of the things that we cannot allow happen, and how this plan has not taken into account everything it needs to take into account. So I agree it's premature. I hope we can come to agreement with the executive and then work with our colleagues in Prince George's County to send a strong message of the type of path forward that we want to see. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you allowing me to make some comments today.
Glad you could join us. Okay, Dr. Orland. I'm sorry, you were turning it over to Ms. Rubin. Sorry. Ms. Rubin, for the interruption.
Hi, good afternoon. The one thing I'll respond to in which I think tells a story is before going through the testimony of the public, and we have a lot of smart people in our county who have raised some things that helped us and helped me do my job. Listening to 6 days of hearings was not exactly on my top of my list, but it did help me in my. One of the things I want to say is I find it quite interesting for a 19,000-page document to be incomplete, and it is, and that's kind of it feels like one of these discovery requests where they drop boxes off and say, here is all the stuff, go through it and find it. So in addition to making it very difficult to weed through the document to find the materials that we're looking for, there's a lot in there there's a lot that's not in there, and it's what's missing is key to, I think, the issues that we have as a region. With regard, I say a region because it's both Montgomery and Prince George's counties. And one of the things that I also want to talk about as an overarching view, which I think is great, the way that we have created some really, really good partnerships in going through these the DIS and the process. I will make it very clear that State Highway from the very beginning was not interested in having us work together. The goal, I think, was put us in silos and see what happens. But we didn't let them do that. I think that's a really great part of having the commission as a regional organization, because we were able to connect with our Prince George's partners in doing that. And the other reason I think it's important is that from the very beginning, something that you all might not know is that the reason that Park and Planning was invited to participate as a cooperating agency versus a participating agency really had nothing to do with our planning. They only invited us because we own so much of the parkland. And the problem with that is that they don't recognize and have really never acknowledged us as full partners in planning, in planning the transportation for this region. And I think that that's important because it's important not to let us separate. We really do need to work as teams and work together as a cooperating, as a cooperating partnership, both with the council, the executive, the planning, the Park and Planning Commission for both Montgomery and Prince George's counties. And I think that that's helping us. And one of the reasons is that there are so many issues that have come up with the DEIS that it's not possible for one of us, one group, one agency to address every single one. So one of the things that as at Park and Planning as staff, what we have tried to make the commission understand, and I think they do, is that although we recognize and understand what all the issues are in this process, we each need to be a true partnership and understand what are the strengths that we have as individual agencies, as individual organizations in our kind of responses. So one of the reasons that we did not, when I say we, I mean Park and Planning, did not come forth with a recommended alternative is because that's really not where our strength is. Our strength is in looking at the impact to the natural resources that we hold in trust, and also to look at best practices in land use and transportation planning. But there are many issues here that we've addressed, and I think what we have to do is continue that partnership and determine who would be the best party to actually carry the banner on that particular issue. Some of them overlap, but I think that's important to understand. For example, the discussion about the P3 and whether it should move forward. I think that's a very strong. I think the strongest party in our partnership is the legislature on that one, because it's a state act, it's a state law, it's the P3 Act, and they've been working very hard to to try to strengthen the oversight and the involvement of the legislature in that law. And so I think it's something that we should, when we're looking at what's our strategy, I think that it's to push, we each come up with those items that are important in the legislature every year. And I think that the P3 Act has got to be on the top of the list to push the legislature, the state, our delegation should be, they're fighting hard for it, but they should understand that's the area that they should, be carrying the banner. We should, of course, support that, but I don't think that we have any real strength in trying to make that happen. And that goes with the same thing with regard to when we talk about the financial viability of the project. There's a lot of arms to that, but the point is the taxpayers and you all as the council, the respective councils, both Montgomery and Prince George's, are the ones who protect the taxpayers in that regard. So it's really strong. It's really important. I love that, I think it's great that, you made the statement on the WSSC and the costs as associated with the water system. And that's important. And that was really where it belonged. I don't know that the Park and Planning Commission doesn't have this, we don't really have that same, it's not in our wheelhouse. It's not part of our role, but it is part of yours. And by the way, I will let you know, I had a conversation with Bruce DuPoit last week with me, and he's going to be doing, he's doing a lot of investigation into the utilities and the costs of all the different utilities, not just WSSC. So, we're going to start seeing some of that come out. The question of how much of the tolls are, what the costs of the tolls are. Again, that's not in Park and Planning's wheelhouse, but it's very important for the council. It's very important for the taxpayers and the people that are going to be using that. So when we talk about the issues, I think it's important for everybody to start considering who the best partner in this is to carry that banner, and how can you get support from your other partners. So I just wanted to, as an overall statement, talk about that because it's very important. And the reason, which is one of the reasons that when we made the presentation to the commission on Wednesday, we talked about the JPA. So there's a joint permit application. So there's Clean Water Act permit applications that are also part of this whole process. And the joint meetings or the hearings were called joint because there were representatives there from Maryland Department of Environment and the U.S. Corps of Engineers, Army Engineers, because they are also at the same time that they're going through the NEPA process. The state is also, and the lead agencies, which is SHA and Federal Highway Administration, are making their permit applications. So because it's Clean Water Act and because we have involvement in that, that's where we see that's one of our strongest points of I don't want to say attack. Attack's not the right word, but it's of raising objections to incomplete information or flawed analysis, and asking because as a cooperating agency, our job is not to stop the project, and I keep explaining that to the community. Our job is to make sure that if this project is going to happen, it's the best it can be. And that's what we keep trying to do, is to let the State Highway Administration know how they can better inform themselves and therefore create a better project that will ultimately address what the real needs are in this region for transportation. Transit being one of them. It's very important, and that is one thing that's going on, is that they're negotiating already with the Department of Transportation. I know Chris has been working on this with the point is the funding for transit that will come out of the project. So the very important question is, where's that? How much are we talking about? And when are we getting those payments? And at the same time, remember that the planning department is working on a corridor forward plan, which is to help you assess the priorities of the county for those transit needs. So when we get the money from the P3, from the toll revenues, you all as the council can make a decision as to where that money should go. So we are working together on how to address these things. And it's important, I think, to make sure that the state understands that that is what we're trying to do. So with that, let me just, the reason that I guess that Glenn called on me was to talk about where the public raised issues, because I can go through the issues that I've raised and, they're generally the same. They've been the same from the very beginning. I think you all see what they are. I think the next step is for us to assess who should carry the banner and how we best do that moving forward in this process. So if you give me a second, I'm going to pull up the memo. Okay, so what I found was, interestingly enough, and we all know that when people are testifying about a project, it's unusual to have as many people testify in favor of a project as those who are opposed to it. So it's not unusual or surprising that those in favor of a build alternative were outnumbered by those who are opposed and were in favor of a no build alternative. So what came out, but it was quite telling in that of the 140, I had 127 people on my list, but I think we could recount that. But only 15 spoke in support of a build alternative, and none of them questioned anything in the DIS, any of the analyses, any of the information that was included. It was more motivated by those. There were a lot of businesses that were concerned about wanting to get in on the ground floor. There were construction companies. There were construction supply companies. There were engineering companies. And it's important that, yes, this should be looked at as an economic development tool, but is it the right way to go? I just don't, I don't think it's cooked yet enough to be able to provide those advantages right now when those small companies really need it. But of those people, the two alternatives that they selected, where they went through, they preferred alternative 9 and over and then next they preferred alternative 10. So 9 is the 2 lanes in each direction. Excuse me, the 2 lanes in each direction with hot lanes. In other words, to provide some kind of a discount for multiple vehicle or multiple use vehicle HOV. So it incorporates HOV. It doesn't necessarily tell you whether it's going to be 3 or 2 occupants. It doesn't even indicate whether it's going to be whether there's free travel in the managed lanes versus just a discounted travel. So it just simply says that if you're in a high occupancy vehicle, more than a single occupant vehicle, you will get some kind of credit on the toll. Alternative 10 is essentially the same footprint, but there is no advantage for multiple occupant vehicles. So that's called that really essentially the reason 9 was preferred over 10 is it motivates non-single occupancy vehicle use. HOV creates less burden on, it'll get used more. It may create less burden on local roads. And it's the best way to potentially meet some of the environmental justice needs. You know, low income people who can't afford the managed lanes can always go in HOV. But the problem with that is we don't really understand from the DIS and the analysis whether or not any of those environmental justice communities would take advantage of the managed lanes. Can they travel by carpool? We don't know. That's as I said, there's more missing than there is, and that tells a story. So of the no build alternative, and everyone spoke of it as a no build alternative, and let me just make one more point, is that state highway, federal highway have made it very clear, and this is an issue that we should be addressed, is that they're not looking for a conglomeration or a mix of different alternatives. They're only considering a single alternative. So that it does create a problem. I'm not saying I think it's something that needs to be said then, if and when the council is making a recommendation for a preferred alternative on the Western Corridor that doesn't necessarily mixes different alternatives, because that's not the direction that they have indicated that they're looking for. So, of course, that is a big deal. Of the no-build alternative, most people were concerned because transit and travel demand management, or either TMD or TSM, I'm not really a transportation planner, so I always get the terms confused, but things like telework or metered entry, things that will, you look at other than simply building the road. Those are what people tended to focus on. And I think that's consistent with the county's regional transportation planning, is that we don't want people, we want people out of their cars. I mean, this is about moving people, not moving cars. So that was a huge issue that got a lot of comment. There was a lot about COVID. People are concerned about not just in the change in travel, people's travel, how they travel. It's also about a couple other things. For example, there are companies that are saying, well, we're not going to provide complete telework, but they are going to have scheduled, or they're going to change their peak hours to allow for people to continue to social distance. In other words, if you're limited in the number of people you can have in an elevator going to a high rise, you got to be very careful about having everybody arrive at the same time. So what that does is something that needs to be looked at, is not just a change in means of travel or whether you're going to telework, but what that does to peak hours. Does it flatten the peak hours? Does it take the peak hours and spread them out? And there's been no analysis of that. And then finally, the question of revenue projections from the tolls. That's going to do a lot about a question, not about just about the financial viability of the project and how much money the government is going to ultimately have to put into it. But it's a huge question about transit, because if, in fact, the mechanism for getting transit through this project is to get some revenue from that project, from the tolls. Is there going to be enough revenue to support that annual payment of revenue for the local jurisdictions to pay for their transit priorities? So again, a lot of the community comments had to do with the standards. The DIS was below. They didn't include a lot of government transparency or inclusion. They agreed with us that the LOD was flawed. There was a lot of discussion about local roads. The local road system has not really been analyzed at all, what the impact is going to be. And then the question that I would address for you all as a council is, how are we going to pay for the adjustments to the local road system? How is it going to affect our already overburdened local road system? Is it going to create additional congestion? There's been a lot of questions about Connecticut Avenue. There's been a lot of questions that deal with 29 and how that's going to be impacted through, you can get people onto the highway, but if they can't get off, then how's that going to help your congestion? So the other thing so they did talk a lot about the things that we talked about. Social justice was a big issue. The fact that the environmental justice analysis was incomplete. They've done a they've started to identify some of those communities, but we don't know what the impacts are. We don't know what the concerns are. And one of the things that environmental justice is supposed to do is bring marginalized community into the government decision-making at the very beginning. And by pushing it off into the FEIS, the final environmental impact statement, to address what those concerns are and then mitigate for it, is really going back to the way it was done earlier in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is you just, you impact these communities and then you tell them what would be the best thing to help them, not be so poorly impacted. And that's really not the way to handle it. But the other things that the community have raised that is not within our wheelhouse, which is what's really important, has to do with construction, the construction plan. This is going to be, regardless, this is going to be a long-term construction project. So what is the impact going to be on the communities, the surrounding communities during that construction? We don't usually get involved in construction planning and how that construction management and how that's going to be done. I think that's something that either Montgomery DOT or DPS do a lot with. And I think it's important to push state highway on that, because those temporary and impacts are going to also be hugely significant. They talked a lot about the greenhouse gas effect, the air quality. Again, that's not something that Park and Planning usually deals with. We've identified them as problems, and we're hoping that one of our partners will take the reins on that. And a lot of communities are really concerned about the change in the character of their neighborhoods. There may not be a lot of the state is claiming there's not a lot of total takes. In other words, that a lot of people won't lose their entire property, but it will, in fact, change the character of their neighborhoods, and it will also impact the character of their homes. So those are the things that have been addressed, and with that, I'll pass it back to Glenn unless there's any specific questions.
Okay, Carol, thank you.
Come on.
Are there any other questions before I move on? Or, if not, I'll press ahead. I see the letter that the executive and the council sending ultimately to really have two parts. One part would be to enlist all of the serious shortcomings in the draft EIS and the concerns we have, all the things that Carol mentioned, maybe even a few more. But then the second part of it would be to lay out at least what our the council and the executives preferences in terms of what should be built. We've done this before. This is not new. We did it. It's been a while, but we did it for the Purple Line. We did it for the I-270 project that went on through most of the decade of the aughts. In 2009, there was a joint executive council letter which weighed in very specifically about what improvements should be done from I-370 north to the county line as part of a study that went all the way to Frederick City. And of course, back in the day, the mid-aughts, it was done on the Intercounty Connector as to what the preference for the executive and the council was. So certainly, even with all the concerns there are with the data and the incomplete analysis where there really isn't data, this is the one opportunity the council and the executive has under the NEPA process to say this is what we want, because the comment period ends November 9th. And so I feel pretty strongly that the council and executive should say something. They can say it as either as definitive or less definitive as it wants, of course. But unless we say what we want, we may be missing the boat in terms of having any kind of a control over what happens in terms of a build option. So that's why in the packet, after working with planning staff and DOT staff, I spent a considerable amount of time, in fact, some other executive branch staff as well, looking through the 19,000 pages and coming up with all kinds of concerns, but to also try to understand what the different options were telling us and to take out of it what might actually be beneficial to the county. And although Carol did say that the state is looking for us to pick one option, you're not beholden to do that. You can pick whatever you want. This is your expression of what you think ought to happen, and you're not bound by one alternative or another. And so that's sort of in that vein is what I've come up with. So although I work with DOT and planning staff on the analysis, in fact, they did most of the analysis. I mostly asked questions of what did you find? I don't want to take credit for that. I did some of it, but not most of it. The conclusions in here, the recommendations I have, or suggestions really I have, are mine, and just mine, nobody else's at this stage. So let's go through, starting on bottom page 2. First of all, in the section of the Beltway from Prince George's County, actually from I-95, since that's the logical terminus if you go east, to the west spur. So including the Beltway to the east spur, but also the section between the two spurs. That the county's position should be no build, or at most TSM, Transportation Systems Management, some elements under that. What Transportation Systems Management are actual physical changes to the roadway system, but without making a major change, something that would make it work, the existing layout more efficient. And Carol mentioned a couple of them. One is perhaps ramp metering in some locations. Could be extending an exit lane. I can think of one example of one where it might be useful, which is the eastbound lane, exit lane going to Georgia Avenue. Right now it backs up pretty far. Well, let's put it this way. Before COVID-19, it backed up pretty regularly. And the plan is to actually reconstruct that interchange so that not just the eastbound to southbound traffic, but also the eastbound and northbound traffic would be on that same ramp. And that's really to improve the weaving, the nightmare on Georgia Avenue underneath the Beltway, particularly in the PM peak. And this is actually part of the Forest Glen Montgomery Hills plan that you adopted earlier this year. But those are both examples of TSM type of improvements, but not adding any through lanes to the road. And the reason isn't because there isn't a demand. There is a demand. There's no question there's demand. But it's a matter of the impacts. We know that the impacts in that section of the Beltway are much more severe than anywhere else. By my count, and I just looked at the mapping, I maybe not didn't look at it carefully enough, I saw 35 homes being taken in that section, single family homes, and I think 1 or 2 businesses. And then many, many others, scores of others, which although are not necessarily taken, on roads demolished, but are negatively affected because they're much closer to the road. The ICC alternative is an alternative for some of the trips, not all of the trips. I agree with Carol that the purpose and need was drawn too tightly. Basically, it said the alternatives have to deal with the traffic that's all the traffic demand that's going to be on these roads. Well, sometimes you have to measure that against what the impact is and what the cost is. And so I think the ICC alternative is a valid one for many, maybe not even a majority of the trips, but a many of the additional trips.
Can I interrupt you 1 second, Glenn, on that? And I'm sorry. Couple things on the ICC. The reason, just so you're aware, the importance to it, in addition to the reduced costs because it's already built, it's the reduced environmental impact that is a
Right.
requirement. But also, there's one other point that I want to make that I haven't really made before, and it hit me when I was listening to one of the presentations that State Highway made. In all of the other alternatives, they do an analysis of what does it do to the managed lanes and what does it do to the general purpose lanes. And they keep arguing that even people who don't go in the managed lanes get the benefit of travel reduction or reduced need on the general purpose lanes. They've not done an analysis of the ICC looking at it as the managed lanes of the top side of 495. And 495 would be the general purpose lanes, whereas the ICC would be the managed lanes. So they haven't kind of looked at how that impacts a reduction in the use of 495 and therefore opens it up for some people who it makes sense to stay on 495, like people traveling from College Park and wanting to get, to Virginia, or local needs like, somebody, people traveling between, Silver Spring and Bethesda, if they're going to use the Beltway, obviously, that it reduces some of the traffic on there. And they didn't look at that at all. So I just want to make sure
Right.
that have that.
That's a good point. And another point I want to make about the draft EIS, and this is not uncommon for draft EISs which look at more than one jurisdiction or ones that as large as this, but nevertheless, it's almost impossible for someone reading the report to be able to identify what the reduced impacts are on houses, on businesses, on parkland, on wetlands by segment. So I just made the comment that the section of the Beltway between the West Spur and Prince George's County is the heaviest impacted. But I cannot give you numbers because that's not the way the draft EIS is put together. There is the total impact of all of Alternative 9 from 370 down to the Beltway and all of the Beltway around to Route 5 in southern Prince George's County. So I apologize for not having information, but there really isn't either way. There's no way of getting that unless we were to ask State Highway to actually go back and generate that. And we didn't do that. I don't know if we could have, but or they would have been able to do it, but we don't have that information for you. But just our own knowledge of what's going on in these sections can tell us something. And just finishing up on this section of the Beltway, we do want to make sure that we include this interchange improvement at Georgia Avenue, the Beltway, which is actually part of the Forest Glen Montgomery Hills plan you adopted in January, which would get rid of that loop ramp in the southeast quadrant and replacing it with the traffic getting off of that current eastbound off ramp going south, which would also be eastbound to north. Essentially mirror imaging what's happening on the northeast side of the Beltway and that interchange. That will significantly improve traffic on Georgia Avenue, but it may require extending that exit lane. The next section I want to talk about is the western section of the Beltway from Virginia, and the boundary of Maryland is actually at the high water mark of the Potomac on the Virginia side. So most of the bridge is actually in Maryland, but from Virginia over to the I-270 West Spur. I'm recommending that we consider adding the full 4 lanes of what Alternative 9 would call for. That's 2 managed lanes in each direction. I have a chart on page 3 which summarizes the traffic volumes in 2040 in both the AM and the PM peak hour. And you see there, those numbers translate to a need for 2 managed lanes in each direction. Basically, a freeway lane carries about 2,000, maybe a bit more than 2,000 vehicles per hour if it's operating at 55 miles an hour. And the general use lanes at 9,000, we're talking about 5 lanes in each direction for that. So we're talking about adding 4 lanes across the bridge and in the western part of the county up to where the I-270 spur and the rest of the Beltway continues. That section of the Beltway is 100 feet wider in the section of the Beltway through Silver Spring and the eastern part of Bethesda. It can accommodate an additional 4 lanes without taking any more, taking any homes. The one impact, which is that I think all of us consider serious, is the potential impact on the Moses Morningstar Cemetery. Our initial look at it seems to suggest that the problem isn't so much from adding the 4 lanes, is that adding another a lane in the middle off of the managed lanes, which would ramp up to River Road, because River Road is one of the locations where the state's recommending providing a direct access ramp to the managed lanes to be able to carry transit, either buses or drivers paying the toll. In my comments, what I'm saying is we should basically say the state should do everything they can to avoid that, obviously. But until more detailed engineering is done, we really don't know what's possible. So that's a big caveat there. And then the American Legion Bridge itself, the recommendation is to make sure that it's wide enough to also carry a shared use trail, shared use path, that it would be an important connection for bikers, primarily probably recreational bikers, but also some commuters could use it, connecting to Virginia from the Potomac and Bethesda areas and the Sino Canal Park and MacArthur Boulevard. I also made the comment that the planning board has on several occasions mentioned the possibility of rail going across the bridge, and I misspoke in this memo. Carol corrected me. What I said was their planning board is recommending that historically is recommended widening the bridge further to allow for rail. That's not true. What they're saying is making the bridge strong enough, structurally strong enough to be able to carry rail over it. The example is what happened on the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, whenever this was, 15 years ago or so, when that bridge was entirely rebuilt. It was rebuilt so that the center couple lanes could be repurposed as rail lanes, and the bridge was built strong enough to be able to support that. So that's a comment that they have made. And then in between, and I'll just keep going through this parts of it if it's okay. Unless you want to interrupt, please do, and with questions or whatever. Then on the section of the...
Can I follow up on that? Can I just follow up on that point, Glenn, before we lose that? It's confusing to me. I imagine it's probably confusing to one or more of our viewers. What would be I remember the reopening of the Wilson Bridge. I certainly agree with your point about carrying a shared use trail, and I think the trail over the Wilson Bridge, which is much longer, is terrific. What would be the point of strengthening the bridge to make it sufficient so that it could carry rail, but not having the right of way to allow for rail? How would you actually think about that?
Well, there are plenty of issues with this. Frankly, in my point of view, it's sort of problematic that we would ever have rail across there. But I did want to share that the planning board's thought about that. But the point is that rail could be overhead, it could be underneath, or perhaps, depending on circumstances, perhaps 2 lanes could be repurposed as a rail right of way on the bridge. So it's silent on all of that, but just that the structural part of it would be the same.
And since I've already interrupted you, maybe this is a good time. I know Chairman Anderson's trying to weigh in, so let me call on him on this point or whatever he wanted to add.
Thank you. I just wanted to get in at this point. I agree with what Dr. Orland has said about not needing to confine yourself to one specific alternative or settle on a final, drop dead position. But I think that it would be most useful from the 3 different levels at which this decision operates, which I would say are, there's a political level, a legal level, and then there's what happens in the real world. And hopefully your thinking on all 3 of those things will intersect and lead you to a position that is internally consistent from the point of view of all those 3 things and also within each one of them. So what I'm getting at is, while I think that it's important to lay out all of the potential problems, and we've certainly tried to do that in our comments, I think it would also be helpful if you can give not only the state, but also the Park and Planning Commission a little bit of direction as to what your end game is. And my suggestion along those lines is to leave it at a high enough level of generality that it doesn't get too much down in the weeds of the particulars of exactly what exit a ramp needs to come down on, or whether it's BRT or MARC or something else for transit, or what the precise details are, but the bigger picture of what it is that you would expect to see. And honestly, it would be helpful if you could provide some backing to us in our position that if we don't get that general outline of what the county considers acceptable, that it's a non-starter, meaning that we're prepared to dig in our heels and do whatever is necessary to oppose this project if the basic outlines of the county's position are not met. And what I had in mind were, number one, transit, including A, the money for transit, not necessarily specifying exactly what transit infrastructure would be paid for, but that there would be some toll revenue available for it that would be guaranteed, and that it would not await payment for construction of the roadway in order to make that money available. And B is the capacity on the bridge that you've been talking about. Secondly, not widening the top of the Beltway, which I think Mr. Hucker has addressed many, many times. And thirdly, to take a position on the tolls. And the information about the tolls is, of course, the precondition for even having an intelligent discussion about it, which the state has really not been forthcoming with. And that's important not only because it has an impact on the finances of the project itself and also on any transit revenue that might be available, but also on travel behavior, greenhouse gas emissions, what happens to congestion, what it does to other transportation infrastructure is largely going to be driven by how much it costs and how much, as well as how much revenue is generated for the benefit of other projects of the state. So I would urge you to, yes, lay out all the specific ideas and concerns you have, but also try to come to a general position that we can help you achieve in our role as a property owner and as a planning agency, as well as creating the strongest legal position as if in the event, which none of us really want, which is that we would have to litigate. And also, most importantly, what happens in the real world as to what makes this project a good or bad thing from the point of view of the public interest of the residents of Montgomery County.
Terrific. Thank you.
Right, moving on with some of the more specifics. I guess I should mention the reason why the 4 lanes, I believe, are needed in the western section is because the traffic in both directions are relatively even in both peaks, and they are high enough to be able to warrant 2 lanes in each direction. On the section of the spur, the west spur between the Beltway and the lane divide, there today we have 6 lanes. The 2 inside lanes are HOV lanes, north in the evening and southbound in the morning. And the recommendation here is to add 2 lanes so that you have 8 lanes in that section. 4 lanes would be managed lanes, the 2 HOV lanes now plus 2 more, and then keep the same number of general use lanes. That would bring you up to the Westlake Terrace overpass, where there is planned direct ramps both to the north and the south in the state's plans at least. And in our plans, actually, our master plan calls for that, which is really important in terms of providing a connection from the North Bethesda Transitway, from the Red Line to this point, and then to points in Virginia. That's the mass transit we could have in the relatively, well, I won't say near term, let's say the middle term. And then on 270 itself, from the lane divide north, and you recall in this phase the state only goes as far as 370. It appears that alternative 13B largely would work. This is the option which takes the existing 2 HOV lanes, one northbound and southbound, and reconfigures the road so that they are two managed lanes heading both southbound in the morning and northbound in the evening. So with the configuration instead of today where it's 2-3-1-1-3-2, 2 lanes of local lanes, 3 general use lanes, HOV lane, 3 general use lanes, 2 CD lanes, total of 12 lanes, would be 5-2-5. 5 general use lanes heading southbound, 5 going northbound, and the two in the middle being reversible 2 lanes. There is more right-of-way available to do this. Actually, I should say that it's going from 12 lanes to 12 lanes, generally speaking, and it would take up possibly less space because the space between the local lanes and the express lanes and this alternative would disappear. There'd just be one set of lanes. However, in looking at the more details of this, it appears like it would be useful to have one additional southbound general use lane from Maryland 28 down to the lane divide. And I think it has something to do with in the PM peak, even though the peak direction is northbound, there's enough traffic going southbound, and the weaving that occurs between folks trying to get to on the right side of the road trying to get to the east spur, and the left side of the road trying to get to the west spur is significant enough that it can really slow down, is forecast to really slow down traffic. So one extra lane in that section makes sense. So effectively goes from a 12-lane cross-section to 13 lanes up to Maryland 28, and then from 28 to 370 would stay at 12 lanes.
From the spur to 28?
Sorry?
From where to 28? From the spur?
From the lane divide.
Right, okay.
From the lane divide. So coming up the spur, you'd have 8 lanes, 2 lanes northbound, 2 lanes southbound, and 2 general use lanes. But once you get to the main line, and there'd be transition would happen someplace between the Westlake Terrace direct ramps and the main line itself, south of Montrose Road. It would transition from that cross section to the one I just mentioned. Another aspect is, we talked about this back in June when the state briefed us on the transit study related to this. And they pointed out they were going to be incorporating direct ramps from the overpasses in this section from Goody Drive, Wooten Parkway, Westlake Terrace, again, one of which already exists, one of the 2 ramps exists today, and River Road. And I believe that ought to be part of the alternative as well, with the, again, situation in River Road. If that's involved with hitting the cemetery, then some other kind of design needs to be developed to not affect the cemetery. The rest of the comments really have to do with, in terms of the specific alternative build, has to do with the order of things. And I think the council has said this in the past, that really the project should start with the American Legion Bridge widening and the approaches to it, and then work its way up the West Spur and up 270. And it ought to go that way. And the second phase of the study, which is about a year or so behind this one, which is looking at from 370 up to Frederick, that ought to be far enough done before you make a final decision as to what to do with the I-270 mainline cross-section. Although we just finished saying the 2-lane reversible would work there, until we really know what we really want from 370 north, it'd be best to revisit that decision maybe at that point once we have more information. And we also know what Frederick County stands for, because we're going to also need to it would be nice to have a consistent relationship with Frederick County on that I-270 corridor, as we're trying to do with Prince George's County. Next point is one that Casey's mentioned and Hans has mentioned, others have, stipulating from the outset that there should be a specific amount of toll revenue. I think in the packet I did mention either an amount or a percentage. I'm told that percentage is not going to work, that the Board of Public Works made a different decision about a year ago, earlier this year, but it would have to be an amount, and have that amount be available every year to help pay for transit. Now, what transit? Chris may want to speak about this. He's on a working group with the state to try to develop what that is and potentially how much that money is. But there are plenty of options to use this money in the corridor, and the planning study that Carol mentioned is going to come up with ideas as well. But just top of the head, Carter-Cities Transitway, 355 BRT, the North Bethesda Transitway is the extension of Virginia, BRT on 270 itself using these direct ramps, MARC, potentially even monorail. I know that's being studied. Any or all of those could use an infusion of money from this project. I think another point that we need to state very clearly, given what happened on the Purple Line, and what we see may be happening with this project, is to state out front that there won't be a dime of county money in this. This is on the state and the P3, if there's a P3 to do it. Paid at the office, thank you very much. And there's several other points I didn't include in the packet, which in retrospect, we could add. I mean, Prince George has added some as well. Obviously, something like, well, if the P3 doesn't work, if there is one, making sure that our priorities, other priorities in the county, aren't savaged to pay for this. I mean, the Purple Line comes to mind. Hopefully the Purple Line will resolve, but before this really gets too far going. But even if that's resolved, there are plenty of other projects we put forward, and we, the executive and the council, did in its joint letter, which we identified years ago as priorities, and this never was one of them, really, except in a very general sense. And I'm sure there are others that you can think of that would go with this. So those are my suggestions, and discuss. And I don't know if Chris wants to weigh in yet on any of this. I know at the end of the day, this would be best if this were a joint executive council letter.
I'm prepared to speak a little bit. We've had a couple conversations with the executive about this, although he has not made any determination on what he views as a preferred alternative would be. One of the things that we're wrestling with is, given the uncertainty of a lot of the information and impacts that are shown in this DEIS, is it really the right time for us to be laying the gauntlet down on what the county does or doesn't want to see, or is there an opportunity once the state has been more definitive about its views on this and answered some of the questions that that's the right time? And that's an unanswered question. I'm not making an argument one way or the other sitting here today. I think in terms of the east of 270 concerns, there's not a lot of disagreement about the right way to go. I think there is, at the moment, this is where this uncertainty shows up, is the executive has been consistent in his remarks on this project that he doesn't mind seeing a renovation within the walls, but doesn't want an expansion beyond the walls of the current facilities. And some of the issues with the interchange designs are showing what he views to be unacceptable impacts in areas around Seven Locks Road. So while Glenn's analysis of the traffic demands here, I don't think there's any quibble with that analysis. The question is whether the traffic demands take precedence over the impacts that occur from the facility of the size that's shown here, or whether we're better off suggesting that we prefer a smaller alternative unless it can be definitively proved that those impacts don't occur. And that's part of the overall sense of this analysis that the state has done, is there are a lot of areas with very intricate design that have set the limit of disturbance here, but there haven't been design alternatives for those locations to know whether it could be a more compact design, or perhaps a piece of functionality is sacrificed so that the impacts are smaller. That analysis hasn't really occurred here, so that's a major concern of picking a specific alternative here. No issue with the American Legion Bridge, I don't think, in needing to make non-automobile connections there. You have to go from the chain bridge to Point of Rocks to cross this in any way other than a car currently, and having more opportunity for that is definitely necessary. And there are amazingly nationally significant trails and recreational resources on both sides of the Potomac at this location. So that makes complete sense. I don't have a lot of detail to provide on the 270 configuration, although the executive has been pretty consistent thinking reversible lanes are suitable for all of that, and that is consistent with what Glenn has outlined here. In terms of the transit support at the direct ramps, we are going through a lot of analysis and consideration of where the transit facilities should be, and we need these transit facilities. But whether or not they're precisely at the intersection point of the managed lanes and the side roads is an unanswered question to us now. So we might point to less specificity about where the park and ride and transit facilities are than Glenn has recommended here, but that's a detail. And then I think there is agreement about the toll revenue components here. And just as a status report, we have had a couple coordination meetings with MDOT's P3 team on this. We're still trying to get a common understanding of what the ground rules are for the negotiation and conversation. So there's nothing definitive in place now. I think from our preference, we would like to see some flexibility on both actual project implementation and other capital contribution to the county. And we are in a conversation about whether it makes sense for there to be some operating support from these funds in addition to the capital investment, as obviously they're using the toll funds to operate the highway facility. So we are in the process of trying to understand the scale of investment and the limitations on how any of that investment would be used and the timing of that investment. And we will keep you in the loop as that progresses, but it's at a very, very early stage now. We were given some indication that the state was looking to have significant progress made by, say, March, April timeframe, and don't yet know whether that progress will be made in that timeframe, but we are working as hard as we can with them to get some of these details ironed out. I can answer any other questions you want, but that's sort of the initial reaction I have and to Glenn's suggestions, and we're going to talk more with the executive about if and what type of position he wants to take at this stage.
Could I amplify something that Chris said, which is really important? Yeah, in doing this, we're trying to balance the fact that, this is an opportunity to say what we want, but we all agree we don't have nearly the information we need to make a final decision. So even if you were to suggest the specific kind of improvements that I'm talking about here, I think it needs to be caveated with we may want to revisit some of these based on more information about the impacts. And so, for example, on the noise walls along the Beltway, it's the kind of thing where, yes, they can rebuild the noise walls where they are with putting them on top of retaining walls, which would be more costly, and yet still fit the cross section in. That's something I think that we should be able to support. On the other hand, if it's physically not possible to put in noise walls, even with retaining walls, sitting on retaining walls, then we may come up with have a different position. But I think it's important to give them at least a pretty strong direction as where we're going. The other point I wanted to mention something about I forgot to mention was I did make a recommendation here about at the direct ramp locations where there's talk about putting some park and ride in nearby. I was only saying that we should also put a transit center at each of those as well. A transit center can be something as modest as what we have out at White Oak, which is really just a sort of a collection of, I think it's 3 or 4 bus stops along Lockwood Drive, just basically a place where buses can meet and greet, and people can transfer from a local bus to an express bus. And it doesn't have to be right at the interchange, it could be nearby. But there may be a situation in one of these locations, or maybe more, where there just isn't the opportunity, there isn't the land to do it. And so again, it's a matter of trying to say, well, we'd like to see this, but if you can't do it without functionally not working because it's too far away or because it causes all kinds of traffic impacts in terms of buses getting on off the road, then maybe never mind. But this is sort of the intermediate world we're in between trying to provide some guidance that's more than just words, yet at the same time allowing for flexibility.
And just, Glenn, on the transit center part of the conversation we're having is fewer, larger, or more smaller things.
Right. And I just want to jump into one thing that was telling in a lot of the testimony that was given by the public. A key word that people used a lot was balance. And a lot of the people who testified talked about the fact that saving me a minute or 2 or even 5 is not worth taking all those trees down, or it's not worth having that much impact to the environment or to the community. So it's all about, I think that if you're looking at what, the residents of the county believe, is I think that a lot of them understand that this is a balance test, that you're never going to get to the perfect, it's not all about transportation. It's not making it a perfect transportation project. It's about balancing all of the interests. And I think, so you'll get a lot of support in that regard. And I just, Chris mentioned it briefly, and I wanted to say that that's where the community, that the people that testified, that's what they believe that as well.
On the other hand, an improvement that has no negative impacts is a fairy tale. So there will be some if something's going to happen, and no one should be blind to that.
Sure. Well, let me call on Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Dr. Orland, I appreciate your comments. Clearly recognizing that there are a lot of caveats to this entire conversation. And with regard to the last comments you made in your staff recommendations about the park and ride or the mini transit hubs, whatever you want to call them, I think that's exactly what we're looking for, right? To add some type of multimodality to this very auto-centric proposal. But the reason I wanted to speak was more just to follow up with Director Conklin's comments. Part of where I am right now, I stated my thoughts at the very beginning and share the sentiments of my colleagues as I heard them. But last year, we and the county executive came out with a proposal of sorts, and I know that all of that was not taken into consideration, but we've clearly laid out aspects that we think we can get behind. And so from just a procedural position, Dr. Orland and Director Conklin as well, if there is disagreement between the executive and the council as to what to report back, how does that communication work?
Well, we try to avoid that, and we've been successful in avoiding that for like our priority letter that we just did earlier this year. And in the past, we've been able to do it. And usually there's a little bit of give on both sides. If there's some disagreement, we always find some way of having common ground. At the end of the day, I suppose what could happen if there's not an agreement, particularly if there's substantial disagreement, you could have dueling letters. And that's almost worse than having no letter at all, frankly.
Well, I mean, there's, sorry to interrupt, but quite frankly, there's a single letter, there's dueling letters, then there's a letter that might not have anything in it, right?
Why send it?
Well,
There's everything in it.
We're now 90 minutes into this important conversation, and there are some sentiments that we shouldn't have any position or we shouldn't do anything. And so I just want to drill down on that from Director Conklin, quite frankly, trying to understand what the executive's intention is here. What can you all get behind at this point?
We haven't had the opportunity to go through that conversation with the executive, but we have talked about the merits of no build recommendation, given the uncertainty as an example. The county's position is no build. I don't know, I'm not saying that is, but that's a possibility. If we find that there's too much uncertainty in the analysis that's been presented today, and the state would obviously have the opportunity to provide more information and change that view. It could be couched in that way. There's also the possibility that the council's recommendations and the executive's recommendations, while not the same, could be directionally aligned, meaning both are not the full build everywhere, but they have different scales of what they think is recommended. But as Glenn mentioned, the purpose, the best outcome, and what we would strive for is agreement among the voices of the county and how to phrase this. And we've been successful all along in that process in being aligned.
And I agree with that, and that's the goal, but I'm frustrated that, here we are on Monday, and we know that the comments are due next week, and as we're trying to build this consensus between the two branches of government here, we're not getting any feedback, or direction from you all. And
that's a fair point, and frankly, as Carol had mentioned, I don't think that she was recommending a specific build alternative commission recommendation from the commission, and we were approaching this in the same fashion from the executive, that we are prepared to submit voluminous comments, but not necessarily to say, as a result of our review, we specifically recommend that the state do X, because there's a lot of uncertainty based on the comments we have.
And despite the fact that all of us, the executive and the council, have in fact been on the record of requesting the state or greenlighting the state to do X, Y, and Z?
We have suggested they explore alternatives, but I don't think we have ever endorsed a particular project alternative for this endeavor.
Okay. Okay. I yield back.
Councilman Bremer.
Thank you. Wanted to follow up on the idea that we might do a letter. I mean, it sounded like what Director Conklin was alluding to, if I understood it correctly, sort of, laying out what we think are, or maybe it was what Casey Anderson was actually saying, that we would just really get sharper as to what we are seeking. And it might be that we find more common ground on what we're seeking than on, specific elements of what we would or would not support. No build is not, to me, that's not a viable starting point. That would be a walk back from existing, county master plan policy. But, we may not agree on what actually should happen, and maybe it's not that important for us to get into that detail. I don't know. Trying to stick to some of the higher level things, see if we can influence the legislature to forge an agreement over MARC would, I think, be very valuable. There's I guess how we use this moment and use what little leverage we may have is kind of the bigger question. And so I think a lot of, I get where Glenn is coming from. I think we have to, Casey's argument is let's rally behind our bigger negotiation points and see if and then I think it would be presumably through some kind of letter or resolution. I'm not sure how much more there is to say than the existing letters that we have sent, but how you say it can be different. And I think we also had so much in there, that maybe it wasn't as pointed as it needs to be, as you enter this stage of the process. So perhaps, we would have a more focused argument, but there he is. Did you hear that, Casey? Were you able to hear what I just said?
No, sorry, I just got up.
It's all right. I was trying to kind of develop what you were getting at as far as seeking, some kind of, I don't know if it's a letter or what, but, clarity on position from the county for your advocacy at this stage and your negotiation at this stage. Would that be in the form of a letter, or what do you think would be most useful? You did sort of spell it out, but just can you expand on it, please?
Well, yeah, I think either a letter or if you just all were to sort of communicate that consensus to us at this meeting or some future meeting, that the council and hopefully the council and county executive's position is that if there's not a significant dedication of toll revenue to transit and a commitment to not widen the top of the beltway at a minimum, that this is a non-starter. And the rest of the details, I think we can argue about, but it seems to me those are the two big ones that the council has identified in the past, and I don't think anybody in any of our roles in county government or related to the county government are in disagreement with those. So that would be my hope, is that you would make that the official position of the county, and then we can deal with SHA accordingly. We can say, look, our instruction from our electeds is we're not going to hand over any land or do anything else to facilitate this project if those conditions are not met at a minimum. And the rest of it we can, haggle over it. But I'd like to just get some sense in general terms of what the bottom line is.
I tend to agree with Casey's view on this, that if the letter that comes from the elected bodies is at a policy level. That is really important. If it can be more specific, there may be some advantage to that, but I think that's where we start to get ourselves in trouble also with having weighed in on things that we don't yet fully understand the implications of.
Okay. Thanks. Sounds like a good approach.
Yeah,
Mr. Chairman.
I fully agree. I mean, considering the alternatives, I mean, we certainly know a lot more about this. We don't know everything about this project, but we know a lot more than we did last year and much more than we knew 2 years ago. And all of us, I think we have to say over and over, we all want congestion relief. Our constituents want congestion relief, but we continue to have concerns about this proposal and the specifics of it. And as Carol pointed out in great detail and logged in many hours, many of our constituents have weighed in on this formally and informally, and we need to acknowledge that feedback and thank them for that and fashion a response. I think it's appropriate. Indeed, we have a responsibility, I think, to try to, for the committee to fashion a recommendation to the full council and for the full council to work with the executive and try to align our positions. That's the way to serve our constituents the best. And I don't want to abdicate that responsibility by not having a recommendation just because we still have many questions. Obviously, that's been the case all along. Regarding what Mr. Conklin said about the option of not responding to, no build, which has been floated, would be obviously a break with our longstanding positions in numerous priorities letters and other documents on our position on the American Legion Bridge and 270. I don't think that's the right way to go when that hasn't been really our position on this project. And I don't see articulating a position either as laying down a gauntlet as much as simply restating our position from last year in the absence of any evidence to the contrary. I mean, the way I look at it, we put our best people on this project, including many of you in the room. We created essentially, not formally, but essentially a locally preferred alternative that includes an I-200 diversion alternative, some spot improvements on the Beltway, enhanced transit funding, and transportation demand management. MDOT, despite our request, did not study the aggregate impact of that on traffic relief. It would be foolish for us then to just sort of play along with their decision not to heed our request and to now force ourselves to choose between among the less desirable alternatives that they put forward. We have a new MDOT secretary. We're very grateful that he has said over and over that he wants to hear from us and to collaborate with us. And I think we ought to take him up on that. So, and I will add, I've been in touch with the leadership of the Prince George's County Council as recently as this afternoon. Dr. Orland is in touch with their staff. I'm really glad that they continue to share our concern. And I think it's within reach for both counties to send letters that are in agreement on all the major elements and restate many of our concerns that really haven't changed in the last year and allow room to highlight local concerns that are germane to each county. So I think we're largely all on the same page on this, but I don't think we ought to either not send a letter or send a letter that recommends a no-build alternative.
Just to be clear, my no-build alternative is qualified that until the state resolves the major concerns that have been raised about the analysis, not that we think ultimately no-build is the right answer for this corridor.
Right.
That's fine. We don't have to pursue that avenue.
Mr. Chairman, it seems like we are generally in agreement that, the sense of the committee here is that we would prepare a letter that's at the policy level, that clearly lays out what are our set of demands. To preparing that, I don't know that we need to get too much into what is in it right now, but we do certainly have, I like Chairman Anderson's formulation there about no expansion on the Beltway and a firm commitment on toll revenue for transit. And I think you actually, Mr. Chairman, just emphasize your agreement with that as well. So, why don't we proceed to work on that, with the county executive, and let's see if we can all get on the same page.
Right.
So just make sure I'm sorry.
No, Dr. Rowland, please.
No, I just want to because I'm also writing the minutes. And I'm going to hear Mr. Glass on this too, but at least between Mr. Hucker and Mr. Reamer, the idea is that the letter would say no widening on the eastern section of the Beltway from 270 West Spur over to Prince George's County, would include substantial contribution for transit to be determined what the transit is, and to be silent on whether or not to do any widening on 270 or the West Spur or the western part of the Beltway. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think pending, more information, right?
I thought you were leaning towards recommending some type of build alternative from the Legion Bridge through 270.
Mr. Hucker, I think, was sort of. Mr. Reamer was not. Mr. Anderson was not.
Well, speaking for myself, I mean, I am far more comfortable taking a position on the bridge and the spur to the bridge, but I'm not sure that we want to do that now. I don't know that it's needed. I think saying, as you said, that we should start at the bridge, that's a kind of a no-brainer.
What if it were improvements on the Beltway from Virginia to the West Spur and up the West Spur and up 270, and not specifying an alternative, just saying a build alternative in that section?
I think that's fine. I agree with you that we should insist the design be modified to not disturb the cemetery.
Right. And to add the trail bridge. And
yeah.
This may be another opportunity to emphasize that we need to understand 270 in its entirety.
Yep.
Before selecting a preferred treatment.
And to reflect the sequencing that Glenn talked about, so we know where Frederick is, and so we know.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was exactly. Thank you.
So I appreciate working this through and hearing the sequencing behind my colleagues and how they would like to formulate the letter. I agree with it, but I just got to say again, we're all on the record here. We have stated preferences. We know there's agreement, I believe unanimous agreement within the council and in the executive as to the need to redo the bridge, and hopefully we would redo the bridge and have some transit component to it, the spur included. The alternative that was put forward last year in the letter that the county executive signed on to, and that the committee chair, worked on as well, talking about the ICC, and I know that wasn't looked at here, but those are positions that we've taken. And so I started my comments at the beginning of this noting that MDOT is not here. And MDOT clearly doesn't want to engage with us, as many of our guests, panelists have shared their hesitation to talk with us. And so I just kind of want to be aware of what we're doing and what we're not doing here, because if we're trying to get their attention, they've been ignoring us to the dismay of all of us, and haven't been helping our constituents and residents and business owners in any way. And so the steps that we're taking now, I just want to make sure that it gets us to either actual conversation or getting us into a better place, whatever that might mean. And by not making any decisions, I do have some concerns, because we've made decisions and I'm not quite sure what the hope is.
If I could add one thing to that, which I didn't address earlier, the secretary invited, and he and Casey quite many months ago had a conversation about having some kind of agency to agency facilitated conversation and negotiations. And they have actually in the last several weeks reignited that. In fact, they sent us a list of consultants or facilitators, and we responded that we were not really happy with any of the three because they were more slanted toward transportation and environment, and we were really looking for a very neutral facilitator. But they are finally stepping up to the plate, where they want to have it's just Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, and State Highway and Federal Highway would provide the facilitator. So I think what Casey was looking for also was direction, because we have not determined they're also looking for what is an agreement on the scope. And so my question back to them was, when you say scope, what do you mean? Are you saying that this would make it a successful discussion or negotiation? To me, reaching those conclusions on those very high-level policy decisions of the direction that we are getting from our council is exactly the scope that we would be looking for, is to resolve those very high-level issues to our satisfaction, or we can't move forward. So I hear you, but I think that they are now a little bit more open to it. I'm really concerned about who's going to be at those meetings, and we're trying to figure that out. Same old players is not going to get us anywhere at State Highway because they're the ones who dig their heels in. But if we can get a little bit higher level, I think we talked about even leadership, having Casey part of those discussions and having Secretary part of those discussions. So we'll see.
Mr.
So
Chairman,
it's a step in the right direction.
can I just chime in briefly?
Councilmember Joanna.
Thank you. I have to step away, but I'll get a vote in the next round, but I agree with the way the committee's going as far as stating general policy, doing so. And I've said this to Dr. Orland and to folks in Prince George's County and to my colleagues. I think we should get as much agreement between the executive and us as we can, put that on paper before the 9th, talk to the county council and executive in Prince George's, which I know we're doing. They've sent, they have a draft letter. Let's make this as strong a statement as we can on the general policy outlines, and then do what Carol was just saying, Ms. Rubin was just saying about, let's try to also try to get the tangible, real engagement that we need with the folks as the decisions are being made. So I just want to state that I agree, and I appreciate you all letting me sit in. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Can I follow up there on one clarification, though? Glenn has asked us to weigh in with a locally preferred alternative according with a certain timeline as part of the NEPA process. The letter that we're discussing is about a negotiation strategy that is somewhat on a different plane, if I understand it correctly. Can you talk a little bit about that? The only specific reason being, we don't necessarily, if it is truly on a different plane, we don't necessarily have to have it done by November 9th. We should just have it done as soon as, is possible, I suppose. But could Carol, could you speak to the kind of whether these two things should we stick to the NEPA timeline for this letter concept?
I don't think you have to stick to the NEPA letter for this, for the policy kind of direction that we need. However, I do think that the county needs to get comments in what your major concerns with regard to the DEIS, or you're not going to preserve your rights if it does have to go further. I mean, that's, from our perspective, we're trying to make sure that we preserve any rights that we need, because even if we don't sue them, ultimately we're expecting they're going to start suing us for the land. And I'm not sure how they're going to do that and how it's going to work out. But that's always been our leverage. So we are being very, very careful on meeting every deadline. And we've done that for the last 2.5 years. We have met every single deadline that they've put on us. So I do recommend that that the county provide all of its comment under the NEPA deadline. But with regard to those major issues, that's fine. We can establish that when we start sitting down and talking agency to agency, because that is going to be an important point, because we don't get anywhere on those. And it's not anything that we don't have in our comment letter, so I think we're still protected. But it's really got to come from the county.
I agree entirely with Carol. I think it would be a major omission if the council didn't in some way formally correspond as part of the DEIS record. We also have hundreds and hundreds of comments on the DEIS that we'll be submitting independent of the direction of the policy direction, based on being one of the participating agencies. So the county will be commenting. It's just a question of whether there's comments at a policy level or whether they're technical impact and alternative related comments.
We're actually doing both. We're doing our letter, major letter, which is the big policy issues, with legal support to back them.
Right.
And then we're providing, we've got, as Chris said, we've got hundreds of technical comments, and those are going to be attached as an addendum. But really the high level policy ones are the ones that have to be resolved first.
The minimum you would want to do is endorse the concerns of the agencies that have submitted technical comments and ask that they be addressed. That's the floor in my mind.
Yeah, and my point, Councilman Maroon, was just that if we can get that, I think the 9th gives a hook. Not that you have to do it, but I think it just gives a powerful hook.
I think it'd be better. And certainly I think it'd be better now based on what we just heard. I just wasn't sure, because that's quick. We're going to all be working here a lot to get to agreement. So that's all. But yeah, let's do it.
I think Glenn's already working on it. I don't think it's that different than what we said last year because there hasn't been any additional study. And I think we're on the same page as we said earlier today.
Well, I want to make clear about this because what I've heard up to this point mostly is the letter would contain the major concerns from the draft EIS deficiencies and et cetera, which will be more detailed than what DOT and Park and Planning submit. And that we would say no widening on the Beltway between the West Spur and Prince George's County, and that we want a significant contribution to transit from the get-go. But that's it. I mean, it doesn't say anything about, for the letter from a year ago talks about improvements to 270 and the West Spur and the Beltway, the western part of the Beltway, and I've not heard that from the committee so far. I think I may have heard maybe from you, Mr. Hucker, a little bit, but I did not hear that from Mr. Reamer or Mr. Glass, and certainly not from Mr. Anderson or Mr. Conklin.
Can you add one thing to that list? Could you confirm the letters that both you, the council, and the executive, it might have been a joint letter, sent to the commission, asking us not to move forward, asking the commission not to move forward until you all have had your concerns addressed? That will give us, that will give the commission the strength we need to continue on our end.
Well, send us that letter. I'll make sure to do that. But again, it gets back to what is the letter that the executive and the council would be sending to the state? Does it include? Go ahead.
I was just going to. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Are you saying that the letter should have as much detail as your LPA proposal did for those segments? Or is
no. It sounds to me. It sounds like the most that the committee's willing to say is that they would be in favor of or not opposed to, however you want to say it, improvements to the western section of the Beltway, the I-270 West Spur, and the Main Line 270.
Yeah.
Up to this point, you haven't said that. The letter a year ago did say that. Actually, was even more specific. It said adding reversible managed lanes. Frankly, I don't think that works on the Beltway. It doesn't work on the West Spur either. But if that letter actually has more detail in it than the letter I've heard so far. And I'm not saying the letter now should be more detailed than that one. I just want to make clear what it is that you want to say.
This is
I have to write the darn thing
all along that we've been on the record. We've stated what our thoughts are, and you're saying it exactly from the letter from last year. We don't necessarily have to go as far as that, but again, just so everybody is aware, we're on the record.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can't wordsmith it all right now. I'm sorry. I have a hard stop at 4:30. I don't know if anybody else does, but I think that's exactly right. That anything we were on the record for in that previous letter, there might be things that can drop. There might be a reason to drop out, but I don't think you should be unclear about where the committee is. The committee was for everything that is in the letter that we voted for last year. And I think it should include the spot improvements on the northern part of the Beltway between 270 and 95, and potentially the use of the shoulder peak periods and the certainly the Georgia Avenue improvements. So anyway, that's
okay. What I'll do is I'll draft a draft letter,
right,
and I'll circulate amongst the committee members to make sure that's what you were saying before going out with anything. Okay, thank you.
And then we'll stay in touch with Chris. Okay.
Of course.
Yeah, I have a lot of material that I'll work with Glenn to get it in the right format.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're done.
We're good? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Good work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Chris. Talk to you
Bye.
soon.